Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia, PA. This afternoon, we're presenting our fourth and final event in this four-part series on the Meta West. This concept of the Meta West is a geo-economic and geopolitical system. And today, we're really thrilled to have with us former president of the World Bank and member of FPRI's Board of Advisors, as well as a recipient of FPRI's Benjamin Franklin Award, Robert Zoellick. He's going to join our director for the study of America in the West, Ron Granieri. Ron, for those of you who don't know him, although I think most of you do, is an FPRI Templeton Fellow. He's executive director, as I mentioned, of FPRI's Center for the Study of America in the West. He's the host of our People, Politics, and Prose, a monthly series of book talks for FPRI members. He's also associate professor of history in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College, which is why I must say the following disclaimer that any remarks that Ron makes are his own personal opinions and do not reflect on the U.S. government, the U.S. Army War College, the U.S. Department of Defense. I'd also like to thank our members and supporters for tuning in and for supporting us. If you're not yet in one of those categories, I hope that you will consider becoming a member and supporting us. As always, we will take your questions today, so put them down in the Q&A box and go ahead and start doing that at any moment, because Ron has a tendency to read them and sometimes ask them as part of the conversation. So without further ado, Ron, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Raleigh. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Welcome to this special briefing on the Meta West, a keynote and implications for future research. As part of FPRI's Robert Strausz-Hupé Project on the Atlantic System in a World of Great Power Rivalry, FPRI has organized this series of events. This is the, as President Flynn just said, is the fourth of four to discuss aspects of the Meta West, and that is the network of organizations that link the democratic states of the Atlantic to allies and partners around the globe. A guiding idea of these conversations is the understanding that the Meta West exists as a thing in itself, even if leaders and populations do not clearly articulate or even formally acknowledge it. And their adversaries and critics certainly make connections between, say, the G7 and the EU and NATO. Yet it is rare for Western leaders caught up in short-term issues of national and regional politics to discuss explicitly how those organizations can or should intensify their coordination to advance the common interests and values of a large global community, even in the face of mounting authoritarian challenges. Intellectual advocates for the Meta West, however, also fail to realize their vision when they become entangled in terminological or political disputes. Any free society, after all, and especially a community of free societies, should aim to work through disagreement toward consensus rather than insist upon political dogma. The Strausz-Hupé Project has tried to encourage more dialogue about the Meta West, about its shape, its membership, its purpose, its future, in the hope that greater awareness of the possibilities for global action by and within this community will spur policy decisions to better meet the challenges of the present and the future. Today, we will try to pull together the strands of our previous discussions of the Meta West as an idea, as well as a geopolitical and geo-economic reality, in conversation with someone who has occupied leading roles in some of the most important institutions of this Meta West and who has devoted his career to developing and articulating policies to strengthen the West. How should we understand the Meta West as a system? How can the states of the Meta West speak more clearly about the connections between institutions and values? What are those common values? These questions, and yours, will guide us in conversation today with our guest, Robert Zoellick. Robert B. Zoellick is Senior Counselor at Brunswick Geopolitical, an advisory service of Brunswick Group, and a Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. In addition, Zoellick serves on the boards of Temasek, Singapore's Sovereign Wealth Fund, Robinhood, and Twitter, chairs the International Advisory Council of Standard Chartered Bank, and is on the Strategic Council of Swiss Re. He is a member of the boards of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and the Carnegie Endowment. He chairs the Global Tiger Initiative and is a member of the Global Leadership Council of Mercy Corps. a global humanitarian agency. Zoellick was president of the World Bank Group from 2007 to 2012. He was U.S. Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005 and Deputy Secretary of State from 2005 to 2006. From 1985 to 1993, Robert Zoellick served as counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury and Undersecretary of State, as well as White House Deputy Chief of Staff. So when I talk about his connection to various organizations in the West, broadly conceived, you can see why I say that. His recent book, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, is recently available in paperback. And so for all of these reasons, to talk about all these issues, we are delighted to welcome Bob Zoellick to this event. Welcome, Bob Zoellick.
Thank you, Ron. Well, I very much appreciate the invitation to be here from you and Raleigh. As you know, I share FPRI's preference for analyzing foreign policy issues with a historical lens. So I thought I'd start us off today with 5 points about the American alliance system in the Meta West, beginning with a bit of history. So first, for 150 years, the US steered clear of alliances. George Washington's farewell address warned about permanent alliances. Thomas Jefferson expanded that caution to entangling alliances. And of course, the idea was to try to avoid Europe's foreign policy of monarchies, militarism, and war. The practical necessity was to try to prevent the French Revolution from fueling factions in the US politics and, importantly, to keep up the trading system. Alexander Hamilton actually explored the idea of a strategic partnership with Britain, but the politics in both countries precluded it, and so Hamilton opted for neutrality for very practical reasons. Over 95% of the young US revenues came from customs duties on trade, so Hamilton had to keep trade going so America could pay its bills for both the debt and for its government. So neutrality was a very pragmatic determination about how the United States would survive and operate in this new world. Now, John Quincy Adams' response to Prime Minister Canning's proposal of cooperation in 1823, what later became known as the Monroe Doctrine, really sealed the anti-alliance policy for the United States. So for the next 100+ years, avoiding alliances became the holy writ of US foreign policy. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Woodrow Wilson did so as an associated power, not as an ally. His post-war design tried to reconfigure the neutrality doctrine dating back to Washington and Hamilton into a form of collective security rather than formal alliances. So the point is, one can consider much of American foreign policy for its first 150 years as an effort to engage the world without alliances. Now, this wasn't internationalism or isolationism. And I'm stressing this historical point because many of these older American international ideas are worth recalling today. For example, ties of trade and transnationalism, cooperation among republics, especially in the Western Hemisphere. Seward, as Secretary of State, had a vision of a North American Union, a voluntary association among 3 republics drawn together through economic gravity. Teddy Roosevelt was a master mediator of balance of power politics in Northeast Asia. Also, in the first Moroccan crisis, he tried to avoid the European conflagration that came within a decade in another peripheral fight in the Balkans. Charles Evans Hughes used arms control, but connected to a regional security balance. Elihu Root had ideas about how international law could build cooperative regimes and diffuse friction. And I'll return to some of these legacies in a moment when we get to the present. Second point, the US break with the past, the creation of the US alliance system that all of us have grown up with, came in response to problems and crises from 1947 and 1950. It was not done through some grand strategic design. In 1947, after George Marshall had a long, frustrating ministerial meeting in Moscow, he concluded that Stalin welcomed European despair. He thought it would serve the communist purpose. So the Marshall Plan was, in fact, an economic response to the security challenges, and originally it intended to avoid a military commitment. But the United States soon recognized the Marshall Plan wouldn't work without Germany. That led to a shift in policy and the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949, a topic that Ron has done a lot of work on with Adenauer. And those moves triggered the Berlin blockade and airlift. To address those dangers, the US finally had to commit to the idea of a North Atlantic alliance as a defense against the Soviets, but also as a response to reassure France and Western Europe about this rapid policy of West Germany's revival. Now, the process of alliance development in the Pacific developed somewhat differently. Alliances with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan were spokes in a wheel. They weren't a regional system. And as Victor Cha's book explains, they were designed as much to restrain our friends as well as protect them. There was a regional design, the SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, but it didn't last, although it's left the United States with alliance commitments to the Philippines and Thailand. Now, what I want you to note about this quick run through history is the economic complement to the security design of the new system. The Marshall Plan is an economic design. The creation of GATT for world trade in 1947 to spur economic recovery. The export-led growth of Japan and later South Korea and the ASEAN, and the emerging roles of the World Bank and IMF. Third point, this new US-led alliance system always faced difficult issues and always had to adapt. Sometimes there's a tendency these days to look back at this period with rose-colored glasses in the Cold War and assuming it was easy. It wasn't. For example, alliance leadership has always required special skills. For example, the Berlin crises posed the question of the full extent of the US security guarantee. Would it include nuclear weapons and deterrence? Lyndon Johnson and his advisors misapplied the Korean experience when they decided in 1964 and 65 to take control of the ground war in Vietnam. So the question of would our guarantee extend to the security of Vietnam? After the failure in Vietnam, Nixon's doctrine called on allies to assume more responsibilities for their own defense. France actually left NATO's military alliance while remaining within the alliance politically. Critically, the dual-track INF deployment and negotiation really became a turning point in the European context because Moscow recognized it couldn't break the North Atlantic Alliance. And then President Bush 41 and James Baker demonstrated consummate alliance leadership in ending the Cold War in Europe. That was followed by NATO's enlargement to the east and a reluctant effort to force the end to the war in the Balkans when European countries alone failed. But the US also had to manage economic challenges from allies who were also competitors. The US and its partners negotiated these issues, but often with great difficulty, and often required the United States to force an adaptation. One of the sharpest examples of this was Nixon's decision in 1971 to break from the fixed exchange rate system of Bretton Woods. James Baker used the G7 finance ministers to prod realignment on exchange rates and avoid protectionism in the late 1980s. In part of the negotiation was an expansion of rules for trade through 8 rounds of negotiations in the GATT that led to the creation of the World Trade Organization in the 90s. And as Ron mentioned, the system as symbolized by the G7 actually becomes trilateral. And through the global financial crisis of 2008, that actually expands to a G20, a larger group. Fourth point, reflecting on this historical experience, we can identify US interests in this alliance or meta system. The system adds to US weight in foreign policy, whether militarily, economically, politically. It offers a forward presence for US bases in Europe and Pacific, and those match US geopolitical interests, an area in which FPRI has always had a prominent role. The alliances can encourage military interoperability and combined operational capacities, which has been and will be increasingly important with advances in technology. The system has built institutional capacities to mobilize resources, mediate disputes, facilitate negotiations, and build habits of cooperation that add to its resilience. And these ties create a basis for cooperation across a wider range of issues, whether they be economics and development, humanitarian, environmental, now biosecurity, technology, democracy, and free societies. And importantly, they include a wealth of private sector actors, transnational actors, if you will, from both business and civil society. Now, the US also benefits from the perspective and ideas of others, though this requires listening, negotiating, and navigating US domestic politics. And this is perhaps the greatest challenge in that old frame of reference of diplomacy. It's not so easy to necessarily spend time with others and get their perspectives. But so you might want to conceive of the Meta West as a network system with a subsystem of security alliances, economic and transnational arrangements, and nodes that are represented by key countries and international institutions. And here, like Ron, I'll stress the necessity for ongoing negotiations, considering the political constraints of your partners and understanding different perceptions and priorities. The US-led system has appealed to other countries because it's enabled them to pursue their national interests while assisting with US and systemic interest. And that is the heart of the matter of the meta system from the US perspective. And I'll just offer an observation. As the US seems less willing to negotiate its politics at home, we have to ask whether we still have the patience for these international negotiations to make the Meta West system work. Fifth and finally, looking ahead, US alliances across the Atlantic and Pacific continue to serve US geopolitical interests from both the western and eastern frontiers of Eurasia. Yet we should also recognize the usefulness of alternative partnerships. For example, India's involvement with the Quad, even though India will maintain strategic autonomy, for historical reasons, India will not be an alliance member. It'll want to maintain its independence of action. But nevertheless, it can create a different cooperative arrangement. North American economic integration can strengthen the US continental base. The Five Eyes intelligence arrangement. Israel and perhaps the Abraham Accords as a basis for Gulf security. Partnerships with Singapore and other ASEAN countries. And of course, US alliances must continually adapt. And the recent AUKUS announcements offer a good example of what, while the submarine purchases have gotten most of the press attention, I think the real issue there is deeper defense technology industry cooperation, which probably grew out of the intelligence ties among the three partners. Japan has moved very carefully towards greater mutuality of security as part of its interpretation of self-defense. It's expanding its maritime role, and most recently, likely seems to be expanding its military spending. It would, of course, help if Japan and South Korea could improve ties. But there are shifting priorities within the Atlantic Alliance too. Cyber interests, hybrid threats from Russia, especially for the Baltics and Eastern European countries, terrorism and instability in North and Sub-Saharan Africa. And very important, I think the EU will turn out to be a key partner for the United States in facing the biggest challenge, which is how to deal with the rise of China. Now, the missing piece of US multilateralism today relates to international economics. The United States abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Japan and Australia continued, 11 other economies. And the saddest aspect of this was that the whole design was based on US free trade agreements. The US had free trade agreements with 6 of the 11 partners. The structure comes from American law and preferences. We're not taking initiatives for the digital economic trade, which increased, started actually around 2009 and 10, but have really been accelerated by the pandemic. The US hasn't explained the changes it would like to see in the WTO to reactivate the dispute settlement process. So we have friends in the WTO that might like to help with some of those issues, but the US hasn't even stated what it wants. We're even retaining tariffs based on a national security justification against the European Union for steel and aluminum. And note the strong contrast with the US roles in the past about advancing standards, rules, norms of mutual interest. The US alliance and partnerships should also be the foundation for wider cooperation on transnational security issues, such as climate, biological security, and cyber. And it's useful as well to come back to this idea about considering ideas from America's pre-alliance experience, such as the trade and transnational ties, cooperation among republics, today we'll refer to them as democracies, a vision of North American cooperation among free democracies, the use of arms control arrangements linked to regional security, for example, with North Korea in Northeast Asia or in the Persian Gulf. Finally, but critically important to remember, US foreign policies always have to be based on strong public support. Now, the surveys from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs show encouraging backing. The support for alliances is often in the 70%, 73, 74, 75, by figures of about 68%. The public wants the US to play an active international role in cooperation with others, not unilaterally. But of course, these statements of opinion are inchoate. And the critical question will be how they can be developed and in practice. Now, while many people enjoy discussions of grand strategies, and those are topical issues, I don't think they will in fact will be the way to define the path to a Meta-West system. I think it will depend on diplomacy addressing specific problems, actions, not just concepts and words, but operating with a framework, which we've crudely touched on today, of US geopolitical, economic, and political interests. And it has to be adaptable, it has to be resilient, it has to be practical, and it won't move in a straight line. So Ron, over to you.
Well, gosh, thanks, Bob. That was a great tour de horizon, and you got right to a couple of questions that that I think can get us really rolling here. I mean, one of them is you ended with that reference to this sort of this dubious, do we need a grand design? Do we need a grand strategy? What exactly would that look like? In your book, you talk a lot about the value of pragmatism, and you mentioned it there too. And this is, the one philosophical school that's actually associated in its origins in the United States is pragmatism. Now, older sort of sophisticated European types would say that your pragmatism is a fig leaf for not actually having any big ideas. But I think about this for American diplomacy, American foreign policy, that the construction of this networked system that you describe, you mentioned how some of it is a response to crises, some of it is a series of ad hoc decisions that grow into something else. Do you see a connection between sort of American pragmatism and an unwillingness to articulate big systems and the problem that comes with selling and explaining what the United States is trying to do to its own people? Because if you don't have a big idea, what do you think about that? So,
as in many aspects, I think there's a combination involved here. I think it's useful, as I ended, to have some frameworks geopolitically, economically, what your seminar series has been trying to develop in the Meta-West. One has to consider how to connect the dots. In many of my jobs, I found kind of the benefit that I could add was being in different roles, economic, security, politically, across regions. You try to see the interconnections. It's hard for me to conceive of grand strategic ideas, although you can see these patterns. There are some. Mahan in the Pacific has still probably come up with sort of the best concept, and Mike at CSIS, I'm just drawing a blank, has in his book about the history of this is terrible. I'm just drawing a blank on a thing. In the Western Pacific, sort of explains this very, very well.
Right.
And it basically is that if you go back to Mahan's concept, It was that the United States is not likely to dominate in the Western Pacific, but it's clearly part of a balance. It will focus on the island chains. It basically is to try to avoid getting into land conflicts. The one exception I think we've learned is Korea has been very important to Japan's success. But interesting, Mahan also emphasizes the role of economics and trade and values in the system as a whole. So that's a strategic concept, a framework that I think has still had some broad applicability. I think what I'm partly suggesting with pragmatism is the need to try to understand other countries' politics, histories, and geographies. So sometimes it's best to explain these through particular examples. And let me give you one from my experience, since particularly you know Germany quite well. Some people may recall in the Reagan administration had negotiated after the dual track process, the INF treaty, eliminating intermediate range missiles in 1987. But this, of course, left the short range missiles in Europe. And so when President Bush and Baker came to office in 1989, NATO was committed to modernize those short range missiles, but the German attitude towards them was represented by Volker Ruhe, who said the shorter the missiles, the deader the Germans. So the Germans, this was your frontline state with all the role of Gorbachev's appeal. And yet we were about ready to have a crisis in the course of the alliance. Bush and Baker shrewdly recognized this. And in May of 1989, they came up with a proposal that many historians have almost lost sight of, which was the proposal for the conventional forces negotiation. So it was to drastically reduce and equalize conventional forces in Europe. This turns out to be a critical event. Now, it takes the short-range nuclear issue and pushes it back because the need for short-range nuclear issues modernization is much less if you've got equal conventional forces. It deals with the German political problem and seals the German-American partnership right before the unification process. And of course, it has the benefit of having Soviet forces leave Eastern Europe, making it harder for them to come back. In some ways, it could reduce some of the military burden for Gorbachev. So it's a good example of an alliance leadership that was based on a recognition of a problem with your core ally in Germany. The one other point, though, that I make in the book about with American traditions is that I identify a tradition of American purpose. And what I use, the example of this is, the anecdotal example is how if you look on the back of a dollar bill, which most people never study, you'll see the grain seal of the United States. And the reverse side, of course, has this unfinished pyramid. Note it's unfinished. The Eye of Providence above it, and below the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. So from the very start, Americans were thinking not just about a nation state, they were thinking about a state with some larger purpose in the world. My perspective is that that purpose evolves over time. And so at first it's just to survive as a republic in a world of empires. Then it's to preserve the Union or possibly have a Western Hemisphere republic. By 1900, it's the balance of power politics that Teddy Roosevelt is playing. For Wilson, it's to make the world safe for democracies, not make everybody into democracies, make it safe. For Franklin Roosevelt, it's the four freedoms. In the Cold War, it's the leadership of the free world. For Bill Clinton, it's the indispensable power. So it evolves, but there's always three components that go to your point about design. One is, what's the context internationally? It's pretty different being a new republic in 1787 and 1789 than it is to be the power of middle 20th century. Second, what will the public support? And third, some sense of aspirations. So always underneath the surface, there's some sense, whether it's to preserve republics, expand freedoms, but the challenge of diplomacy is that mixture.
Well, and I'm so glad you mentioned the back of the dollar bill. You know, the president, the boss of the Center for the Study of the America and the West, Professor McDougall, will of course be very pleased for any discussion of all of those Masonic symbols that are on the that relate to this idea, the vision of building in America. There is a certain mysticism to the American founding that the United States sort of leaves itself the option open to be greater than it is, whatever that greater turns out to be over time. But you also raised this is very good too, because the image of in Asia that the United States pursues a kind of hub and spoke approach to relationships, whereas in Europe there's a little bit more of a organized community. But in general, when we think outside, beyond just the Atlantic area, when we think about this meta-Western community, it is very much hub and spoke in the sense that the United States is the power that can or should act as a kind of mediating force, right, to encourage the Europeans and the Asian allies of the United States to think together, to encourage the Japanese and the Koreans to cooperate with each other, and to try to overcome their history, even though that's a very imperfect thing. But in the institutions that do exist, I think about your experience at the World Bank Group, but even when you're sitting at the National Security Council and you're imagining, on the one hand, right, U.S. relations with Asia, with Asian democracies, U.S. relations with European democracies, how, if at all, has the United States worked to bring, say, Asian and European democracies together? So that the United States doesn't always have to be the one, the conduit through which these relationships develop.
So, pardon my earlier senior moment as we were talking, I recall it's Michael Green's book about
yes.
more than
Thank you. I would have. I debated trying to look it up, but I couldn't do that on my screen.
No, it's sorry. I think Ron, I have always thought of this more with the help of a Venn diagram.
Okay.
So I see it as more intersecting circles, and that's why I use sort of the network analogy. And I think if you include economics into security, or even more some of the transnational and scientific and technology issues, you start to see greater overlaps of functional groups, so beyond traditional sort of security alliances. And some of these can build on one another. So we mentioned, the G7 process was always very important for Japan, because it was the link to its global position separate from its relationship with the United States. Korea, one of the great success stories of the late 20th century, recognized that it had a larger systemic responsibility, and President Lee of Korea in 2010 was very proud about chairing the G20 session and trying to take over some responsibilities on the environmental side. Now, good American diplomacy recognizes that and tries to connect those dots, or connect the system as a whole, and trying to see some of the benefits. And again, you mentioned the World Bank. With the right attitudes of the leadership, but also supported by the member states, those institutions can become catalysts in this process much more than people recognize. So again, I think examples are a good way to drive this home. When during the global financial crisis, when bank regulators all of a sudden recognized that they needed to shore up capital in banks, they put in all these requirements for major banks to build up their capital, and many of them were sort of adding risk elements to, for example, trade finance in sub-Saharan Africa. And Pascal Lamy, who was then head of the WTO, and I was at the World Bank, recognized that even though sub-Saharan Africa hadn't been the cause of the crisis, and in fact, the developing economies actually helped bring things back, that the sub-Saharan African economies would have been very badly hurt by this pullback. And so we were able to get the bank regulators at BIS and others to reassess and relook at the risk possibilities to maintain trade finance. Another one in the pure European context was that a number of the Eastern European banks were owned by Western European or Austrian banks. And as they pulled their capital back, you would have a negative multiplier effect in Eastern Europe. So I was at the World Bank, and I wanted to do this with a European partner. So I worked with the European Bank for Reconstruction Development and the banks in the region themselves, and put in capital from IFC, our private sector arm, to help avoid this problem. And whether you look at, if so many of the issues of globalization today, if you think about it, biological security, climate, international economics, these are not going away. Now, what's happening is the governance of globalization is fraying and fragmenting. but the underlying problems are still very much a part of it. Again, we're about ready to be on the edge of this Glasgow Conference of the Parties climate change conference. In the sort of late 2000s, when Hank Paulson was Secretary of the Treasury and I was at the World Bank, we came up with the idea that while developing countries would want financial assistance, most developed economies were not just willing to write checks and hand it over. So we created a series of climate investment funds at the bank. These are separate funds, and we raised about $7 billion from developed countries. We leveraged it to about $70 or $80 billion. And we created a series of experiments about adaptation or forestation or sort of energy sort of issues. And it's an interesting example that the UN system said, okay, we want to take that over. They created a green fund in Korea, but it really hasn't been able to do anything. And those funds in the World Bank have kind of withered. So this is a practical example about how you can use these institutions to help deal with systemic problems. And frankly, from the point of view of the US, sort of connect regional and national interests with global ones. I mean, another one that's, that should be in the mind today is that, in the 2000s, the HIV/AIDS crisis for Africa was absolutely devastating. And President Bush 43 came up with the PEPFAR initiative for HIV/AIDS, later did something with malaria. Probably did more to save lives in Africa and did more for America's interest in Africa than anything in our history. And it wasn't just providing money and vaccines, it was also a distribution system. So during the transition in the Biden administration, I urged them to be more forthcoming on the pandemic and perhaps look at that as a model, because it gave the United States sort of a leverage that only the United States could provide, going across all these regions with the companies and working with different African countries. So this is what I mean, Ron, about kind of, it takes practical actions. You have to know how the institutions work. But at the same time, what I'm also trying to explain, as you have, is how to see how these pieces interconnect.
Well, and that question of seeing, I'm glad you brought up Africa, because one of the issues I wanted to make sure that we discussed is, at FPRI, we are standing up a very vigorous Africa program under Ambassador Charles Ray as the director. And Ambassador Ray actually posted a question just now, and that is, where does Africa as a continent fit into the Meta West? I mean, we talk about Africa as a vector for particular, there are particular problems that need to be addressed, but how do we think about the relationship of Africa to these existing communities, especially given that some of the most prominent members of the Western Alliance were an integral part of Africa's colonial past? Sort of how do we make that sort of as an economic, as a political issue, as a part of the world that has enormous potential, but also faces enormous problems? How should we imagine the role of Africa as a potential, sort of member partner of the Meta West, rather than merely as a target of policies aimed to deal with problems?
So as you look at the demographics of sub-Saharan Africa compared to the rest of the world, where most populations are shrinking or stabilizing, this is clearly going to be an important factor in international economics, society, and security issues. If you're in Europe, you're either going to help sub-Saharan Africa develop economically and have good governance, or you're going to expect a flood of migration, which we've also seen, whether it's in the US or in Europe. And of course, what I've observed, even over the course of my career, is you started to move through different post-colonial phases, and you started to get different generations of leaders in sub-Saharan Africa. Some of them started to also think in regional terms, and I think this is to be encouraged. And what I found is it was important to have relations with the African Union as a whole, but operationally, sub-regional bodies, West Africa, East Africa, some in Southern Africa, Central Africa still had its challenges, were often more effective, whether it was dealing with ECOWAS or whether it was some in East Africa, in part to encourage their economic integration, but also their cooperation on problem solving. So when I was at the State Department in 2005 and 6, I was given the difficult task of dealing with genocide in Darfur. Well, the United States was already fighting, 2 wars. People weren't so excited about sort of entering a third one, but we wanted to try to see, what we could try to do to at least get humanitarian supplies and see if we could stop the terrible sort of killing and violence. Well, we ended up using a combination of African Union forces, sort of UN capacity, and I, to this day, appreciated the role of the Rwandan military, which was far more professional than others. And I was just talking with the Rwandan charge this past week about noticing the role of the Rwandan forces in northern Mozambique. So there are possibilities here where you can get sub-regional groups that can be backed by support of others. So in the case of Islamic radical terrorism in the Sahel, you've had French forces. Notice how they've been backed by U.S. logistics and intelligence and sort of and lift capacity. So you start to see these interconnected sort of dimensions. Now, I believe that there's important possibilities here on development and growth, and whether they're markets and good governance. At root, whether it's Africa or any other part of the world, development doesn't work unless the locals own it. And so here, again, one of the role of institutions like the World Bank or the African Development Bank is how can you share the experience of other developing countries? So a lot of what development institutions can do is not just fund programs, but it's a knowledge transfer. And what's changed from 20 or 30 years ago is it's not just a knowledge experience from the US or Europe, but there's a broad array of developing countries. We've seen what's worked and what hasn't worked. And again, just to give you a practical example, Mexico had started a program, maybe now 15 years ago, called Oportunidades. It's called the Conditional Cash Transfer Program. And the idea was you give money to those at the very bottom. It was the bottom 10 or 15%. And it was just cash transfers, very, very efficient. But it was conditioned on sending children to school and having women go for health checkups. Probably did more for health of women in Mexico than anything in its history. You could pay for it with about 0.5% of GDP. So it was very, very efficient. Now, what was interesting was based on that model, that's basically the model that Brazil used for Bolsa Familia, which turned out to be very popular for Bolsonaro. But also the World Bank, we were able to help by the time I left, about 45 other countries look at that model. And as opposed to just saying, well, here's the paper, how it's done, you could connect people that have actually dealt with the practical problems in Mexico or others. So this fits your meta idea where it's partly a shared experience, but you need certain nodes and catalysts in the network to drive it forward.
Right. Well, and when we talk about, you mentioned North American economic cooperation, and the idea that there was a time when in Washington, when I think about the 1820s, think about Secretary of State Henry Clay, a firm believer that the future of the United States was working in conjunction with the other new republics of the Americas, right? This would be a place for the world to start afresh. In some ways, right, the shift to an Atlantic vision was sort of corresponded to a changing U.S. attitude towards our sister and brother republics to the south. We could talk about that, but the idea that the Latin American relationship, right, Western Hemisphere relationships, that if I think of Western civilization, it's hard not to think about Latin America as a part of Western civilization. And yet so often when people talk about the West, right, they're usually only talking about the North Atlantic. And so I think both as a practical political issue and as related to economics and political development, how should American partnership, U.S. partnerships with the other republics of the Western Hemisphere fit into any kind of larger vision for the West?
Well, again, part of diplomacy is that there's opportunities that come and go. So in the 90s, the Clinton administration was trying to pick up on some of the end of the Cold War momentum, having the Western Hemisphere being the first democratic hemisphere, tried to talk about various trade issues. And obviously that's come back today. Now we're struggling with a series of other topics. So I think it's useful for students of policy and officials to think about planting seeds for the future that you hope your successors will develop and grow. So let me be more specific. The Clinton administration had an idea of a free trade area of the Americas, but frankly, it's the example of more rhetoric than reality. You were never going to bring along Venezuela. You had challenges with Argentina. Frankly, Brazil's policies were more protectionist. But so back when I was U.S. Trade Representative, I tried to put in place the cornerstones of something that could grow. So keep in mind today, the United States has free trade agreements with Canada and Mexico, 5 Central Americans, Dominican Republic, Panama, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. Now, those are all spokes in the wheel, FTA. But one would hope that at some point, when, again, the political moment provides itself, you could actually integrate those into a regional system. And perhaps with a critical economy like Brazil decides that it wants to follow a more open liberal path, you could connect it to Brazil. Now, if this sounds like a pipe dream, recall what we just discussed about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was 11 other economies. We had free trade agreements with 6 of those. And so the TPP came out of those 6 prior free trade agreements, and then sad enough, we dropped out. Now, to even take this one step further, the original logic was if you could use free trade agreements to have higher standards for services, intellectual property, transparency, labor and environment questions, you could also affect the global system. So whether it be Latin America, whether it be sort of the Pacific, someday the African countries as well. We did a number of free trade agreements with Arab countries, with Morocco, with Jordan, with Oman. And the idea was, again, to try to use economic relationships and economic rule of law to help develop these postures going forward. So this is the notion of sort of the networked and interconnections. And the nice thing about the Latin American story, at least until recently, was that some Americans who know Latin America may recall that 4 of those partners, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, created something called the Pacific Alliance. So even without the United States, they were 4, frankly, open, reform-oriented economies. Now, all of those are under stress today. I mean, Colombia is probably in the best position. So there's no assurance, as I mentioned, about a straight line. But if you want to develop the concept of the Meta West, you have to have a sense of how can you sort of lay potential foundation stones and when can you build on them appropriately. Now, the other problem, of course, is you have to sustain this in domestic politics, which we haven't. So my major point to you was, for all the talk of multilateralism in the Biden administration, it's missing the trade component.
Well, and this gets to a question that you've touched on already. One of an anonymous attendee raises the question of the issue of developments in the United States. Wokeness is the term they use, but how is it possible, or how can it be possible for the United States to talk about developing any kind of communities that are based on any kind of shared values when we have a very difficult time explaining what shared values might be? When we're divided at home, but because when you talk about economic cooperation, because this is something we had our discussion about the economic Meta West 2 weeks ago, a week ago. They all run together after a while. But one of the issues is right that economics, while a very powerful way to link culture, link communities, is amoral, let us say, or because it is not necessarily connected to any particular moral vision outside of making sure that everybody can make money. That can work to link people to each other, and then they can grow together. But what if they don't grow together? I mean, how do we articulate any kind of a vision that goes beyond just let's do this while it makes us all rich? Because the day might come when it doesn't make us rich, but we still think these communities matter, right? Because that's what I see when I see the collapse of TPP in the United States. It was because economic and political disagreements in the United States made people essentially give up on the idea of the larger good of encouraging cooperation with our partners in Asia. Instead, we viewed everybody as an enemy because they would take jobs.
Well, your
they will do
question,
that.
the
And
question,
so this is what happens, you know, agreements based on land. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
well, I was just going to say,
Yeah.
the way that the questioner started it, I think is the heart of the issue,
Okay.
which is when Americans want to encourage us, first, we need to do so with some sense of humility. You know, we have our own problems, and frankly, the best antidote to things we don't like around the world is demonstrating we can make America work. Now, as part of that, your domestic strategy also has to have a sense of whether you see America's national and international policies as interlinked. Sometimes the Trump administration, in a sense, tried to see these as being opposites. In my view, they're two sides of the same coin. And what I mean by that, for example, in competing with China, there's some voices that are trying to have the United States imitate China. I think that's a big mistake. I think our strength as a people is our openness to ideas and goods and capital and people. And that doesn't mean we don't have to have security measures for technology and make sure that some of the people coming aren't there for espionage purposes. But it's what is your basic thrust and direction? And that there's an inclusiveness about that. So even in your last question, we talked about the Western Hemisphere. You know, I discovered this speech that Ronald Reagan gave in 1979 as he was launching his campaign, which is amazing. You couldn't conceive it today, where he said, you know, the United States would be better off if Mexico and Canada were stronger, not weaker. And it's time that we stop thinking of our nearest neighbors as foreigners. Well, that's a rather inclusive set of idea, but you could see the vision that he was trying to drive at. Now, but the next step is, while approaching with this with some humility, it doesn't mean that you have to retreat. Is that where can you find the mood for freedom is not extinguished. If you look at Belarus, you know, if you look at the kids in Hong Kong, the desire for this will always be part of other societies as well. It's not just a US or a Western sort of concept. However, you need to understand sort of the political and economic context in which it's working. If people don't have enough food to eat, if they're feeling insecure, if they're sort of threatened with internal conflicts, well, obviously it's going to be harder to sustain. So where I think the United States and its partners can be supportive, and this goes back to whether it's trade or development or others, you try to create the conditions for this to succeed. Economic growth certainly you're right, it doesn't necessarily ensure democracies, but creating the middle class, creating rule of law, this creates better conditions, but there's no assurance. You know, we saw the development of South Korea, we saw the development of Taiwan, we've seen sort of Indonesia. On the other hand, you have the Chinese example, but the Chinese example also isn't finished yet. You know, so we'll see how that sort of works out over time. So this is where, again, I think one needs to have a long view about this. And when you talk about making your relationships work with allies, and if you think about Europe today, this is where having some historical experience is important. So you know this since you know Germany so well, but you know the German attitude towards secrecy, data privacy, these types of issues, the reluctance to use force. I understand where these may conflict with US politics at a given time, but just as in my story about SNF and INF, you're going to be more successful if you understand where your partner is coming from. And this is where Kissinger has this wonderful phrase about fantasy negotiations. In some of the debate in the United States, there's this assumption that, you know, the United States will state its position and others should agree. And if they don't, we will speak more slowly and loudly, right? And then people will agree. That's just not the way it works. And so, again, part of my theme in writing the book, Ron, was to talk about the practical work of problem solving, and you know, not to make the perfect the enemy of the good, and realize that imperfect results in a far from perfect world can still be pretty good.
It's hard to beat that. I got to say, we have just a minute or two left, but that is That's a good way to think about it. I want to throw one last question at you about don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And that is that a question, and this is combined a question from O.D. Mayer and from Steve Schinkel. Part of it is the idea that we have these institutions. The Chinese, of course, are getting more influential in some of these institutions. And should that make us worry? And connected to that is O.D. Mayer's concern in general is, how do you feel about the American capacity to deal with the world when things don't go the way we hope they're going to go? We decide we want to leave Afghanistan. We hope it'll be peaceful. It's not. We may want certain states to engage with us. Maybe they will engage with us. Maybe they will not. I guess this is for you to expand upon your previous comment about how should we imagine a world where the adversary gets a vote, and a world in which chance can still play a role in how things turn out, right? How should we plan for the future?
So as for the first one, I think Evan Feigenbaum at Carnegie was the first one to observe this, so I need to give him the intellectual credit. The Chinese strategy with international institutions has been two-track. On the one hand, they've wanted to work within the institutional structure we've described, and whether it be advancing their people or their interests or their norms or their standards. And my response to that is shock, shock, that countries would try to do that. Now, the real problem over the past 5 years was that the US quit trying to do that ourselves. And it's a little hard to beat something with nothing. So if you're not going to engage in those institutions and sort of try to organize other coalitions, try to find win-win solutions, you're going to lose ground in it. Now, but the second track was that China's use of something like the Belt and Road, I think, represented an older tradition, the Chinese tributary state, with the notion that others can benefit from the association with China, and it can be quite good economically and maybe even in security terms, but you don't challenge Beijing, you don't challenge the imperial masters, and you certainly don't criticize the Communist Party. And so I think China sort of tried to play both of those. Now, having said that, and again, Evan's done some interesting work on this, there's sometimes some of the Belt and Road development has obviously backfired in terms of debt and lack of sort of environmental issues or lack of local labor force. But Evan has done some work to point out that China's adapting. It's changing the nature of the Belt and Road in ways that are trying to be responsive to some of the local publics. And the United States needs to do that as well. So this is part of the larger global competition that we should be able to be effective at, given their appeal of our society, the strength of our institutions, and the realm of our partnerships that we talk about. Now, as for the second part of the question, about kind of when things go wrong in the process or we don't sort of get our way, this is where I think a certain amount of realism needs to be connected to your policy, which is, look, there's some problems you can solve, there's some problems you can only manage. If you look at some of the issues we face with North Korea or Iran, will they really give up their nuclear programs in a realistic way, or you're going to more likely have to rely on deterrence policy? I mean, that now, having said that, you could still take steps that could lessen some of the tensions. So, I mean, here's an idea that I've not seen tried. In the case of North and South Korea, why not look at the example of conventional force negotiations that was used in Europe? Why not use that to try to reduce some of the tensions on the peninsula? And so I think this is where some sense of strategic patience, but still combined with activism. So sometimes people use strategic patience as an excuse not to do anything. There's a good book review today about the new book about Kissinger and the Middle East, done by Martin Indyke. And what the review points out is that sometimes a step-by-step process, as Martin points out, is going to be critical to trying to move towards a longer-term strategy. And Martin actually says, in some ways, Kissinger was wiser at this than some of the efforts tried under Clinton or Bush or Obama with sort of the Big Bang approach. So I have always favored, actually, kind of an incrementalism, but with constant movement, as you can see with these trade agreements or development or security. However, as you and I were discussing in the case of Helmut Kohl. Now and then there'll be big moments, and then you have to be prepared to grab them, as we did in German unification in the course of 10 months.
So plan, but be flexible. Know what you want, but know what you can get.
Eisenhower had this wonderful phrase about planning is everything, but as soon as the battle starts, the plans go out the window. What I think he meant by that, it's been my experience, is he was understanding the different variables. He was understanding the challenges, and then he was in a better position to try to maneuver around things. As you point out, part of pragmatism is understanding chance and contingency.
Right. Well, Bob Zoellick, thank you for all of this, for this conversation, this getting us thinking about how the Meta-West is developed. I mean, I would say that we're hoping that these discussions can be the beginning of future research and future conversations. I would say some of the issues that have clearly come up in this conversation include getting at the sort of the intellectual development, sort of the intellectual history of these movements, of these organizations, what ideas drove them, how ideas have changed over time. We could do a lot more work on that. We could do a lot more work on how organizations like the World Bank, like the IMF, how they function as catalysts, as you talk about. I mean, we need to think about those institutions. We need to think about how they work. We should think hard about not only how domestic politics in individual countries affects foreign policy, but also how understanding the way that domestic politics in one country affects domestic politics in another, and how we, if we want to think in terms of community, what has worked to make people think that way, but also what are the barriers to that kind of thinking, and how can we move in directions where people can be aware of that, or where can we recognize our limitations in understanding what is possible. And if anything, right, by looking at the successful communities, we can understand that they didn't develop overnight, and what it takes to the kind of combination of strategic patience and activism, right? That you still want to do something, but you know that you can't do it all at once.
Well, Ron, it's like you have a very full agenda. And let me just say that I very much appreciate what you and your colleagues do at FPRI and the people who are your supporters. As you know, on the idea of public support, none of this will work if it only comes out of Washington institutions. And one reason I've always been a big supporter of FPRI is that, you know, you're a center in the Philadelphia area and region that I think draws people to these topics, and I thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thanks for helping me to get to the big pitch at the end of this program, and that is that yes, what we do here at FPRI is only possible because not only of the willingness of people like you to join us for these conversations, but the idea of people like all of you out there in internet land to listen to these conversations, to come, to post your questions, to ask, and we hope that you will continue to do so. That if you've enjoyed what you've seen and heard today, that you will tell a friend, that you will bring a friend next time, that you will consider how, if at all, you can or would like to help support this kind of work for FPRI. The world is getting more complicated all the time, and we can't promise that we can provide you with all the answers, but we do hope that our conversations help to pose fruitful questions. And we hope that you'll come back to us again and again to hear us talk through these questions and bring ones of your own. Today's conversation is just the beginning. If you want to know what else we do here at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program at Ronald Granieri, but we hope to see you again. And until next time, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.